All right, in this segment of our lecture, we will discuss the get verb using the URI games. And notice the consistency of URIs here. Returns a list of games. This should say games, not names. My design error here. So I'll fix it over here when I actually implemented it. So get mapping, notice the post mapping is the same. Get mapping is the same. Remember, get is the HTTP verb that should do read and not modify any server resource. And that's what this does. So I did need to add a little bit of support to the game API to do this. So I added this new static method, as you can see, because it's called from the name of the class. Eclipse put it in italic, but you can spot it just from Java rules. Name of the class, static method, and because it's going to access the static data members, and that's the reason why it's static. Let's take a look. So get game names. That's really game names is really the game key, and maybe that would have been a better name for it. But I'm going to stick with the naming convention game name, even though I'm not entirely happy with it right now. I say game get key set. So this is built into the HashMap API, and it returns a set. Not exactly what I need because I need an array of strings, but it also has a method called toArray, and that's why this is an array, not a list, because it matches exactly what this does. It needs a seed array here, and if that array is big enough, it'll put it in that array, and if it's not big enough, it'll create its own array. So you just pass it an array with 0 elements in it, and it'll create a new array for you and return it conveniently in a string array. So going back to the game controller, we returned the names array, and now we're going to return it as games, a list of games, not a list of strings. So I put it in, I convert it essentially by going through this loop, looping through all the strings and adding new games using the constructor with it takes the name, and then I return that. Let's take a look at this in Postman. So I'm going to add a new request to my existing collection. I have demo collection for simple Uno game API, and I have this post one I showed you previously. I'll add a new request here, so I'll go to these dots here and add a request. And this is going to say get games. Save it. Click on it. Now the default verb for these requests is get, so that's what I need. I need my URL since I've used it before. I can just use that again, and then I'll send this request to the server. Now the server is not running, so I'm going to get an error just to show you that again. And now I'll run the server. By the way, this shortcut button defaults to your last setting for the longer menu. So if you've run Spring Boot server before, you can just hit this button to run it again. So here I am, my server is established now. So this should go through, and it does, and it returns an empty array. So this every time, remember, since I'm not storing this in a database, I'm storing this in the games in a hash map. So every time the server runs, that hash map is brand new. You'd need to persist this to a database if you want the server to be started and restarted again, and that's where databases come into play. So we'll need to post a game before we see it. And the get, and there we do, send, and then we'll call get again, and we see that our get works now. Let's post a new game. We'll go over here, and remember all of this is JSON. We'll call this test game. Oh, that's the return value. I need to get over to here to the editor itself and not edit the return value. Test game 2. So if this works, it should cause the factory to create a new game called this. So now get games. Last time we ran it. I notice a JavaScript object notation here. This is for an array, so empty brackets, and then each one of these has a JavaScript object inside of it separated by a comma. We have game ID here, the test game, the first game I created, and then test game 2. So now we know both our factory method is working because it's creating games and storing them for us. When we restart the server, of course, those games are gone, but right now we can run multiple games on our server, and we're ready to finish the rest of our API. One more thing. I could have returned an array list of strings here instead of an array list of games. And the reason why I returned an array list of games is so I could get this JSON object back. So the JavaScript, the Java class is defined with a property called GameID, and that's where this property comes from. It's through reflection, right? So when this was serialized, when these objects are returned into data, that's one of the reasons why this needed to be a string bean, was so that it could be serialized and deserialized. Remember, the post method needed to understand the game body coming into it. It needed to know how to deserialize the JSON, and that's where this comes into play. But also, game has to be a Spring Bean, and this is what's happening here as well. So it's a Spring Bean. Reflection has discovered this property name, the exact name of it, and it's used it to create these key value pairs that represent the JavaScript object notation version of the object. If I had just returned a list of strings, it would be simple primitives, just a list, an array of strings, an array of primitives with no key value pairs, no ID. So that's right. Preferable to wrap these in objects, Java objects, so they get serialized and deserialized properly. And then now game can be extended as we go too, by the way, rather than just returning what in JavaScript is a primitive. We now have an object to return with the extensibility of adding new properties to it. So we'll look at our next requirement next and see if we can do put method.